Is God using you to have influence in the lives of others? Would you like to see God use you more? Do you know the number one secret to having influence? Well, stay tuned. We'll answer that question and a whole lot more in this week's TGIF at Work podcast. How do I bring my faith to work? How do I tap into the power of God in my work-life call? Why am I going through this adversity? Is God mad at me? I'm Oz Hillman, and I've been helping leaders like you answer these questions and more for over 30 years. That's what this podcast is all about. Let's learn and grow together. Welcome to TGIF, Today God is First. Hey guys, great to be with you in this week's podcast. This week we're going to talk about the number one secret to having influence by doing one simple thing. Hey guys, by now you've been hearing me talk a little bit about an initiative that we've been working on. Well, we're about a week or two away from introducing it called the Change Agent Master Mentor Program. It's going to be an awesome thing. I'll share a little bit more about that at the end. But today I want to talk to you about what it means to be a person of influence. Maybe you haven't really thought about that, but everybody needs to be influential, whether it be in our families, our marriages, our children, our community, our workplace. To be a person of influence is very important. And how do you get that influence? Well, today I'm not only going to talk to you about just the one secret, but three different secrets to having influence. And the most important one is we have influence when we become problem solvers. And Jesus did that very well. Every time he met somebody, he solved a problem, whether it be meeting Peter for the first time and telling him to cast the net on the other side of the boat to catch more fish. He told him how to pay his taxes by catching a fish and there'd be a coin in its mouth. He told the prostitute that, to go and sin no more. And he stood in the gap between her and the accusers and solved the problem for her. How about Lazarus, in the grave for 3 days, and Jesus solves that problem by bringing him back from the dead. I find that secret number two to this idea of influence is that we often get influence as a result of a crisis in our life. I think about Daniel. I was watching the series on the Bible that Roma Downey and Mark Burnett did several years ago, and the scene we were watching this week was on Daniel. And I was so amazed at this man's life and how dedicated he was to the Lord. And a crisis happened when Nebuchadnezzar, the wicked king, says, all of you counselors have to tell me my dream and interpret it, or I'm going to kill you. Now that's a tough boss to have, isn't it? And so Daniel went before the Lord and asked him, about this dream, and God gave him a download of the dream. And as a result, he was able to tell Nebuchadnezzar the dream and interpret it. And the net result of that, solving a problem, led to him being protected in that administration along with his friends and the others who were not believers. And so often that's the way God works. Joseph is another great example of this, where Joseph was thrown into the pit, sold into slavery, worked for Potiphar's house, was unjustly accused of a crime he didn't do. And as a result, he had to go to prison. But in that prison, he too was a dream giver. He was a dream interpreter, if you will. And he was able to interpret the dream of Potiphar because of his reputation as a man who was interpreting dreams. And that's a great example of how we need to operate, that we need to operate on a smaller level before we operate on a bigger level. And as you're called to be faithful in the small things, God will honor you in the larger things. So that is a key principle in being influential, is to be influential in the small things as well as the big things. Another secret, number three, is that influence is not determined by your level of stature. You don't have to be a business owner. You don't have to have a high influential position to be influential. And we see this in the Old Testament, where a servant woman who was working for Naaman's household, who was a general in the Syrian army, and he had contracted leprosy. And the servant girl heard about this from the wife, and she came to the wife and said, I know a man who can heal him. And so she introduced him to Elijah. And so Naaman the general went to see the prophet Elijah, and Elijah told him to go to the Jordan River. And in that Jordan River, he was to wash 7 times. Well, the general didn't know too much about that. It seemed like a ridiculous request. At first, he bucked it, but then he agreed to do it after they convinced him to go ahead and try it. And so he did, and he was healed of leprosy, and he gave God glory for that miracle. And so many times that God will ask us to do some things that seems ridiculous. And so, influence is important for us to have. And I think that influence is a byproduct of our relationship with God, not a goal to be achieved. Jesus simply did what he saw the Father do. And as he did what the Father called him to do, influence was a direct result. And the more influential he was, the more impact he had on people's lives. And that's the way it is today. So you start solving a problem in your workplace, in your community, in whatever situation you find yourself, soon you'll be called upon to solve other problems and bigger problems. And by allowing God to solve that problem through you, you bring glory to God. And that's the key thing, isn't it? That we allow God to flow through us to solve a problem. And so I want to encourage you with that these 3 things of problem solving and just being available through a crisis, that a crisis often leads to a problem that needs to be solved, and realize that your stature in life doesn't directly dictate whether you're going to be influential or not. You can be the lowest on the totem pole and have influence. And you and I are called to be influencers, and you want to be God's influencer. And, I met a man named Mark, and Mark was an architect here in Atlanta, has become a good friend. But when I first met Mark, he was telling me the story about how he didn't feel like he was much of an influencer. He felt like his parents who were missionaries were, making a difference in the world, but he was an architect and he didn't see where God was working in through his business. And then he came to my training, my Change Agent weekend training, and there he discovered that God's view of our work is a holy calling, and that he was to embrace his calling as a holy calling, a spiritual calling, and that he was not a second-class citizen. And so he was trying to reconcile his feelings of emptiness and not being used of God. And so as he embraced this new message, a new paradigm shift, he began to be used by God and began to be influential. He now leads a group of men that he's touching every other week in his home, and he's now just written a book, and God is using him. He's a part of my men's group for many years, and we've become good friends. That leads me to talk about the fact that we're about to launch this new program called Change Agent Master Mentor Program. And if you want to be an influential person, if you want to fulfill your destiny and fulfill your purpose and really break through things that might be hindering your life, things like the Change Agent Network and Master Mentor Program could be the answer for you. And so we're getting ready to release that toward the end of the month, and I hope you'll just stay tuned as we do that. And going back to this idea of being an influencer, several years ago I went to Harvard. I was one of 9 speakers speaking there on the topic of community transformation. And an interesting thing happened within about 10 days to 2 weeks of the announcement of this conference. The speakers began to see lies being spread about them over the internet, and I was one of them. In fact, I saw some things on the internet, and I said, oh my, I didn't know I was involved in that. And so, it was an amazing thing. What had happened was the gay and Muslim community heard that there was going to be a Christian conference on Harvard, and they didn't want those bigots on their campus. Well, they went to the dean and tried to get it shut down, and they couldn't get it shut down because we had a representative that was almost like the Apostle Paul. He stood the ground and went to the dean and explained the importance of the conference. And so we ended up having the conference, and we had a small meeting, but it was a good meeting. And the protesters picketed our meeting out in front every day, about 50 protesters. I even had a placard with my name on it where they were trying to tie me to some legislation in Uganda. And I was shocked at that. And so I learned that it was an anti-gay legislation. I had been to Uganda, but it was before that legislation had ever happened. And so we had the conference, and it went very well. We had a professor from Harvard who sat in the whole conference. And so after the conference, we were in the coffee area, and a few of the protest leaders were in the coffee area, and me and Lance Wallnow and another brother invited them to come talk to us in a side room. And we had the Harvard professor sit down and moderate our discussion. And we said, what seems to be the problem? Why are you guys upset with us? And so they began to make accusations about us. And the man who was accusing me accused me of, my policy on the Uganda legislation that was anti-gay. And I said, look, would you like to know the real story behind that? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I had nothing to do with that legislation. I was there in Uganda before it ever happened, and I wouldn't have supported it even if I were. He said, really? And I said, yep. He said, well, I have wrongfully adjudged you, haven't I? I said, yes, you have. And he said, would you like me to have a retraction in the Harvard paper for you? I said, that would be wonderful. I appreciate that. And so we continued this conversation. And as we continued this conversation, we were very respectful for their views, but we couldn't agree with many of them, but we were respectful. And so by the end of the conversation, the Harvard professor chimed in and said, gentlemen, I've been in this conference and your name never came up. We'd be glad to host a conference like this anytime at Harvard. And so he says to them, you guys have wrongfully judged them. And so by the end, we were very cordial with these leaders, and we shook hands, and even some of our leaders spent the evening with some of those leaders, and it was a time of bridge building. And so one of the bottom lines about having influence is building relationships with people who differ from you. We so often want to isolate and accuse others without having dialogue with each other, and that's one of the great challenges going on in our government today, that we just want to take strong positions against one another rather than finding common ground that we can at least talk about and disagree civilly. And so that's my prayer these days, is that our government would get back to a place of civility. And I know that might be a prayer of your heart too. So I hope that this would be helpful to you to think about yourself as an influencer and begin to think about how you can be influential by solving a problem. You see, culture doesn't care who solves their problem. They just want their problem solved. And if you solve their problem, you become influential. I've told communities for many years that if you want to have impact in your community, start solving a problem. Go to your mayor and say, what problem do you have in your community? And how can we, as the body of Christ, through local churches and businesses and intercession, begin to solve a problem? And you'll be surprised at how quickly they'll be calling upon you to solve problems in your community. So I hope that's helpful to you, and I look forward to seeing you next week on our next podcast. And just stay tuned for our announcement on the Change Agent Master Mentor Program. God bless. Have a great week.
Been a longtime friend of Oz's, and receiving his TGIF devotionals, they've just been incredibly influential in my life. Also read many of his books, and so I knew that I wanted to come to this conference, as well as bring in a friend who's a close colleague of mine, and in a process where I knew this conference material would be just life-changing for him. I've been walking in an entrepreneurial calling, but at the same time coming out of a missionary background, and the blend of, and the confusion of, full-time ministry calling versus going into a secular calling has always been something that a lot of people have struggled with. Os's message that, the mission field of the business world is just as valid as another country was just revolutionary to me and really freeing, and always wanting to get deeper and deeper into that. But God has been doing a huge thing in my life the last 12 years, and I know that I need to surround myself with other people and the teaching that is going deeper into the heart of God, especially in the workplace. It offers so much at so many different levels. It's impossible to put it into one statement, but I know that I would recommend anybody who really wants to walk in the calling that God has for them. This is a place where they're going to get an enormous amount of help, information, a community, and an ongoing process that'll continue to feed into where they're trying to go, rather than just some good info, good notes, and good luck with that, you're on your own. It'll be a process that'll keep yielding a lot of fruit.